Yeah, we just went through a demo of Author and a bit of Reader for my benefit, partly for marketing purposes, but it was very messy, as it should be. The key takeaway is he strongly agrees with the work we're doing on maps. And hello, Benjamin. We'll do intros in a minute. I'm very glad you're here. Thank you. I think you missed Windsurf by half a second, and of course, he's the reason you're here. Yeah, just brief summary on that. He's very excited by the concept mapping we're doing, of course. It's very important for him that data can be moved about, which is what we're working on, Fabian, and so on. I had changed a lot of Author for him, primarily by polishing the control click menu, because he's not that much of a keyboard shortcut guy. So that's a really important bridging point. So that was really it. Yeah, Fabian.
I also contacted earlier today Signer, who is a professor at VUB here in Brussels, and he works on cross-media and basically how to bring content across devices, regardless of what kind of device, regardless of what software they use, etc. I'm friendly with one of his teaching assistant also. So I hope to be able to see him and give him a demo before heading to Portland, but yeah, otherwise it will be after. There is no rush. It's not as if we solved everything, but yeah, in this kind of, I think the perspective of being able to literally juggle with files is very fruitful. So I definitely think we can keep on investing resource in this. It's working.
Yeah, very good. Very, very good. Now, I have to actually plug in my laptop. And so what I suggest we do, introductions. Benjamin is new. He was introduced by Vint. So I'm going to just pause my background noises here as I get my cable. If you guys can start, since I all know you, I'll join you towards when you hit Benjamin. Fabian, you're first, then Carl, then we'll see who's next.
Yeah. Okay, hello. My name is Fabien. I joined the group couple of years ago. I don't remember too much. It's thanks to Brendel working on WebXR at Apple. I work on prototyping, so building tiny pieces of software that barely work, but hopefully help to get the imagination going and maybe even sometimes think about new concepts. And yeah, I play with text in all forms, from sketches on actual paper to e-ink devices, but mostly now on XR headsets of any kind, because I do think text will remain relevant, but how to being able to actually manipulate text with your actual hands, I think is super exciting. So I'm a developer. When I say text, I mean text as in description of a sentence, but also as code. Voilà. Thank you.
All right.
And I'm doing the next, because I think we need to probe the next person to get him. Sorry, Carl.
Yeah, I'm Carl Smink. I am a PhD student at Mississippi State University. I got my master's in computer Army Corps of Engineers for about 3 years, doing VR development for simulation software. I have since gone back to school, and I am now working on, as part of my dissertation, developing software-only keyboard text entry interface methods for VR. Over. Chris, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'm a independent researcher. I have a project called InfoCentral, working on distributed and decentralized systems, which is kind of my background with databases. I did some work in the defense industry as well, with battlefield communications and all that kind of fun stuff. So trying to look at that angle of the future text in terms of how we manage large scale multimodal data for the AI future.
Sorry about the typing sounds there. Who's left for the intros? Okay, Mark. Yeah, I have power on. I don't know who that is you're pointing to.
Oh, sorry. Oh, well, Rob, follow me then. Say very quickly, I'm Mark Anderson. I'm been taking part in Future Text now since about 2017. I'm a visiting fellow and researcher at the University of Southampton, where I did a master's and PhD in web science at the back of the 2010s. I've been doing information since forever. I was originally a medical signals officer way back when, and I've been involved in information systems and metadata, essentially metadata plumbing. Probably what's unusual compared to most people is that my work has involved the data rather than the software that does stuff to the data. Thanks.
Okay, I'm Rob Swigert. I'm a writer. I'm interested in the future of text, and I'm a former futurist, so now I guess my future is in the past.
Is this the future, Rob? Haven't you noticed?
Well, it was, but it's no longer the future.
Just a quick comment on that, particularly with using, the Apple Vision Pro device. It feels to me so incredibly futuristic and so incredibly old-fashioned all at once. It's so easy to imagine that in a few years, this hunky, heavy thing will be an ancient artifact. It's such a threshold technology. Andrew, did you intro while I was getting my cable?
Not yet. I can be fast.
No
I'm
need to be
Andrew
fast,
Thompson.
Andrew.
I'm a I'm a freelance developer. For this project, I'm doing the WebXR programming for, here, so I actually got my headset right here, the Quest 3. So like Fabian, I'm doing some of the development. We're working on kind of parallel projects, and it's been really interesting. I create I guess the primary reading space, and Fabian does a lot of the prototyping and all the really cool stuff. I'm always impressed with his work. So yeah, so we kind of share the load in that case.
Yeah, that's wonderful, Andrew. Quick question. How are the TED lines coming?
I actually just got those working, though it's not quite presentable today. I'll have it Wednesday, no problem.
Okay. Yeah, so Benjamin, when I say the TED lines, I assume you might be familiar with Ted Nelson.
I don't believe I am, no.
Oh, that's fine. Ted Nelson coined the term hypertext, so he's very much loved in our community, and he has all kinds of big ideas. One of them is he wants connections to be visibly shown. So what Andrew has built, which is a phenomenal way to read proceedings or articles in a journal, and when you look at the references they contain, they can now have a line back to the document they were in. So hopefully we will be able to show you that in the near future. Do you have a VR headset yourself?
I do not, no.
Ah, that's so exciting for you. You have to jump in soon. It's the reality of it, as Peter Wasilka would say, who's not here yet, is shockingly different from expectation. But anyway, please over to you, Benjamin. Very nice to meet you. Please introduce yourself.
Okay. Yeah, nice to meet you all too. So I come from a mechanical engineering background. I worked for around 4 years doing research and development in additive manufacturing. And currently I'm doing a master's at Georgia Tech for computer science. So I heard about this project from Vince Cerf, and I was interested in learning more.
That was a succinct introduction. Very nice. Yeah, very good. So I think maybe I'll spend another minute on summarizing some of the discussion with Vint because he serves as a good filtering mechanism for us. And by the way, Mark, as a kind of an aside, the cuttings in Author he really likes, despite it not being spatial, which is kind of interesting. I know you were pointing out a very different aspect, but that's been a long-standing discussion. So, Benjamin, the point of text, of the Future of Text project actually came up in a TikTok today. I was feeling not very well earlier. I had to go lie down, get some warmth, and drink lots of water to be ready for you guys. And as I often do, I went on TikTok, which I know most people hate, and there was a really cool short video on the history of writing on alphabets. And it pointed out the obvious things that alphabets have only been developed a few times separately. Most of them have evolved from a few. But here's the really interesting thing. Yes, well, it depends on whether you consider Mayan or Chinese alphabetic and all of that, Rob. Yeah. It pointed out that, as we know, we don't know if Egyptian or Sumerian was the first writing. And what this guy postulates is that because they're quite different, they may have inspired the idea of writing from one to the other. Because it certainly looks like it wasn't, oh, you do hieroglyphs, we'll do hieroglyphic kind of writing. They're very different. So that notion of it having been the transfer of an idea of writing as just something that exists, I think is incredibly provocative. Oh, Brandel, summarize for Brandel. Hi, Brandel. A brief summary, just had a meeting with Vint. We've done some introductions because Benjamin is new. Can you do a 10-second intro, please, for Benjamin, who will then introduce himself to you?
Sure. I am working on virtual reality and the spatial web standards. So I sort of present here in a personal capacity rather than representing anyone, but I work for Apple designing how the internet or the World Wide Web works on Vision Pro and if any other devices were to come out in the future from that group. And in particular, making something called the HTML model element, a way of being able to play those things inline and trying to get everybody's head around all of the implications of having stereoscopically sort of spatially tracked objects existing as first-class citizens within the internet. But I really like extended mind, embodied cognition, and the idea that if you have more tangible points of reference for how we behave and interact with things, then that's actually how we do thinking. It's not that it helps thinking; it's what thinking is. And so, the more sort of tangibly we can construct things that bear relation to the actions that we take as we think, the better the thinking that we can do. So while it's mostly sort of wrangling standards, talking about USD versus GLTF, it's actually going to be something that helps brains at some point in the end.
Thank you, Randall. Benjamin, and then Fabian, you can interrupt my intro bit there.
Shall I introduce myself again, Brandon?
Yeah, if you don't mind, just briefly, since you did it so succinctly to begin with.
Okay. Yeah. So my name is Benjamin Molnar. I come from a mechanical engineering background. So I spent around 4 years doing additive manufacturing research in metals. And currently I'm doing a master's in computer science at Georgia Tech. So I heard about this project and was interested in it, and I'm here to learn more about it.
Wow, perfect. But Fabian, did you want to interrupt me? Which is fine.
Never.
Okay, good. Your hand's down. Anyway, just a really brief thing. Brandel, I was just mentioning the whole thing of how we don't know if Egyptian or Sumerian came first, but because they're so different, it doesn't look like one copied the mechanism of the other. It looks like one may have inspired the very notion of writing to the other. And that got me thinking that the whole point of the Future of Text project is to help communicate the notion of text for thinking, especially in XR. So it was just a beautiful way of summarizing what we're trying to do, because we're not trying to teach anyone a specific thing because we don't know what it is. We're just trying to get, if you look at the history of writing, a lot of it has been for storage and it's been for thinking. Now it can be utterly expanded for thinking. Fabian, good timing.
Yeah, just to expand a little bit. So during the intro, I was saying I'm here all because of Randall. So whenever there is something wrong, it's all on him. And behind this, it's also indeed the point about thinking in space, with space, like where's the boundary between my thought, the tools, the page, all that. I think it's it's important. And I think I really like, there are a couple of quotes that I like, that we need to think with the tools. And again, is there even a boundary is tricky, which is also, honestly, it's part of my motivation of being a prototypist. Like, I don't write code to write code. I write code in order to think better or further. I don't know if I manage to, but at least that's the whole point. That's what gets me going. And then I put in the chat an image that I shared with Mark and also through earlier, which are, there is a nice book called Inside CERN. So the research center in Switzerland and a bit in France on atomic research, and it's interesting because we see messy desk as per usual, but we see blackboard, whiteboards, we see people standing in front of it, and clearly there are, would, I think, at least my interpretation of it is, the photograph is trying to show the thinking process as it happens. So we don't know how to do this. We don't even know how the brain thinks. Like, we have some ideas, but basically I think it's not a solved question. So we see artifacts through which we believe thinking happens. So again, I'm just saying this, I don't have any clue with this, but the point of re-highlighting again those devices, the headsets and all, it's not like a love of gadgets and emerging technology. It's a quest to understand how more better thinking can happen through those tools, but again, without even necessarily knowing how to do better, but being convinced that indeed this body and mind in space, doing things, including writing, standing up and chatting over a whiteboard on ideas, is fundamental, basically.
Yes. Yeah, that's very much what we're doing. Also, I'm part of a pitch for a research project at the University of Southampton to measure brain activity when working in XR versus not XR, which is turning out to be extremely difficult to even specify what parts of the brain are used. But the reason I find this work so extremely difficult is when I talk to most people, not you, and I talk about text, it's almost like talking about a window, and people will refuse to look at the window. They'll either look at the window frame or the view. To look at the actual elements, the window glass, so to speak, the actual text, it's very, very difficult. You know, people get hung up on the typography or what the words describe, but to actually look at the delivery of text, how it connects to other text, is hard work. Really hard work. And that is why it's the idea of what this can do we're trying to push rather than something specific. Now, just going back to a few little summaries from my meeting with Vint just now, because it was to help promote Author, my word processor for Mac, but of course in an extended way. So he, as I said to some of you, he's not a big keyboard shortcut beyond the basics user. So I've redesigned so a lot of the context menu now does more. And that really makes me think of you, Fabienne, because for those who don't know, one of Fabienne's key contributions is to build an XR environment where the end user can interact with it to change the characteristics of it there and then. So it's kind of like having a context menu on everything. Now, context menu, when I say that, all I mean is an easy and consistent way to bring up options. I'm not saying it has to be click in a linear list, even though that's what it often is. So it is very interesting to bridge easy entry with sophisticated usage. And as we've discussed in this group, sometimes we don't want to do that. We just want to do crazy experiments, which is fine. And other times, especially on the data side, we do want it to go everywhere. And it was quite fun today. Vint asked a lot of brilliant questions, unexpectedly, of course. One of them was about how we deal with metadata and how it can be more universalized. And I pointed out that testing so far with having LLMs do translations work really well. And I know that some of you are bristling at the moment, but at least there's opportunities there. Over. I mean, okay, let's put it this way. One of our mental inspirations might maybe be abstract notion of a latent space, pretending that a latent space is 3D, which of course it isn't in terms of AI and LLM. It's multidimensional, but if we pretend it's 3D, how can we somehow enter into such a thought space? It is kind of interesting because if AI ever gets smarter than humans, theoretically, how would we know? Will we be smart enough to know that they are? Right now, we're trying to invent systems to make us more intelligent than we are now. Do you know when the steel plow was invented? We have a few Americans in the room. It's an American invention.
Like 200 years ago?
About 100. John Deere, the brand that we all know, he was the guy who invented putting steel in front of it's recent. It revolutionized agriculture, right? How can we think on top of the stuff we have now for that kind of a push? The right to repair is a fascinating notion, but I've talked enough, so Mark.
I was just going to sort of so everything basically is a distance from something else, which is how we do the woman is to man as king is to queen sort of stuff, which is basically how the probabilistic 8-ball works at a simple level. But it's interesting too. Some of the early experiments it did 2 years ago with a sort of simple sort of box and line type app in XR is wondering, well, how did the extra dimensions beyond the 2D plane we're used to in terms of laying out data actually help? And sort of thinking this is really for Benjamin is one of the things I think we've found is that it's more about having sort of 2+D rather than 3 or 54D. It's a bit more wiggle room. Probably aggressively trying to play with all the dimensions, I suspect becomes performative. It's not that it can't be visually appealing, but it's probably reflecting the fact that where most of us have a heavy education in broadly 2-dimensional display surfaces, even if they are trying to represent 3 dimensions. I suspect there's something in there, but I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist or whatever, and I don't know the deeper part to it. But it is interesting in terms of unpacking things, and one of the things prodded by Freud I'm trying to do at the moment is to actually do a little bit of a sort of writing on spatial hypertext, which is a rather overlooked area from, well, almost going back to the 80s. So, it starts pre-web, as so many things do, and has just sort of been lost in the weeds for a while. But again, it chimes with Ted Nelson's intertwingularity, the idea that everything's sort of interconnected, and resists slightly the sort of the code first notion that the way to understand anything is to build a force-directed graph of it. You can do that, but it's not normally informative because you're forcing round things into square boxes, and if you get a big enough hammer, you can do it, but it may cause a degree of construction the data you're playing with. So there's some really interesting there's a lot to play for here because I don't think we really know what the answers are, and it is interesting. It comes to mind in the saying of it just now, the degree to which we are actually constrained ostensibly by our education in a broadly 2-dimensional consumption of visual data. Thanks.
2 things on that. Before I address that, earlier we talked about higher intelligence. Doug Engelbart, of course, had the notion of bootstrapping. Didn't expect us to necessarily get here immediately, but if we could get a level above to be able to do something more, we may understand better how to get to the next level. I think that is absolutely crucial, that we try to not say we're just going to be superhumans, because that would be ridiculous, maybe not useful. But how can we improve how we think now so we can better understand how to improve later? It's a really important framework. And also, Fabian, the pictures you sent from the book Inside CERN, of course, CERN is what gave us Tim Berners-Lee's web. It started as kind of a phone book there. That's at least how he presented it to the world. And having had the pleasure, along with Mark, of working to a degree beside Tim Berners-Lee a few times at the University of Southampton, he is much more brilliant than the web. I mean, of course, the web was a huge success, but it is kind of a thing that came out. And when we look at these beautiful pictures, and again, thank you, Fabienne, especially the guy in the lower left-hand corner, there's absolutely nothing wrong with text on a rectangle. It just shouldn't be the only way. So it's really important that we don't get into what some people call false dichotomies. Sometimes that is the best way to read. Sometimes it's the blackboard, sometimes whiteboard, sometimes the entire room. And in the community, we kind of need to remember to define that for the different kinds of problems we're trying to solve, right? Because like Mark was just saying, having a 3D spatial text thing in and of itself isn't necessarily useful at all. But that goes to the other point discussing with Vint when he looked at the map, the kind of concept map we have. It's not that difficult to fill a space with stuff. It's much harder to decide how to hide stuff so you can make sense of that stuff. And furthermore, and this is a real issue, I think, text is visual, but it's also very, very non-visual. So I've been experimenting a lot recently with, you have lots of ideas, you don't know where to put them, you put them in a space. They can hardly ever be summarized visually. You kind of have to have the whole paragraph. Otherwise, you're literally down to one concept that you already kind of know, if it's 2 or 3 words. And that's why we've been working more on the cuttings idea. You have the whole thing. So how to hide and move things is a huge thing. And Fabienne, this is probably going to be a lot of Friday. I'm taking the train to Brussels to see Fabienne on Friday. I'm so excited. We're going to have the whole afternoon and different perspectives of how to do this. So yeah, it'll be good. Experiment to experience, right? So the book as a very, oh yeah, 1 second, Mark. The book as a practical thing, most of the articles are in, they've been proofread, kind of ready to go. I expect midweek I'll send them out to you as a bound book, which will be temporary because obviously for the HTML version you need them as different documents to go through and get inspired. Benjamin, you're way past the deadline, but you are new, so if you feel like writing something, even if it's a paragraph by the end of the week, that would be great. We can then put that in the book. Mark.
Right. Yes, I was just thinking of, in terms of your thinking, sort of Vince's comment about removing stuff. That certainly is a long-known issue for those playing with sort of spatial hypertext maps, and indeed, it's part of what goes into the perhaps counterintuitive observation that messy is good. If you're making it look neat, you're not really engaging with the problem. You're just dicking around with the interface, which can seem harsh, but once you embrace it, it's actually quite helpful. But another interesting thing came out. It was in the Tinderbox forum. I never relate to it often, but and someone was basically asking. They wanted to take in an old manuscript, do some review, and add to it or something. And it was really interesting watching the well-intended conversation around it. But what I began to see was that in many cases, what people were suggesting actually was quite tied to their domain and the way their domain did things. You know, we wear our hats this way in this village. The people in the next door hat wear, they wear their hats the other side. We don't like that, but that's how it is. And that's something that I think our practice wants to step beyond, because if you're just trying to engage with the information, you want to stop thinking in that review term of saying, it's one of the reasons when I was doing my thesis work, I didn't use things like NVivo and something, because it purported to tell you what the answers were. You fill out these boxes. Well, why only those boxes and not boxes about other things? So rather than have emergent metadata, or putting it in where you need it, where it becomes apparent that you want it, and then backfilling, this idea that no, there's a grid. If you fill this out, then enlightenment comes, which is the sterility of a lot of our design at the moment. So I think that's something to bear in mind when we sort of look at these open sort of interpretation spaces, because half the point is for us to be able to look at, in a sense, what isn't there and to posit what might be there.
Yeah. So at the beginning of this year, I don't know if you know, Benjamin, but we got a grant from the Sloan Foundation to do some research in this, which is why it's so great to have a lot of Andrew time and so on. We started looking at this from a more practical point of view. And in the beginning, it was going in all kinds of directions, as any exciting new project would do. But one thing we kind of dropped the ball on a little bit was the meta questions, because we needed to get going. And I think now we're beginning to return to that a little bit, because year one was reading, year two will be authorship. So here's the provocation to all of you. If we are what we think, as we talked about a little bit before, for instance, walking down the street with someone who was a professional dancer and someone who was an economist and someone who was a painter, when you look at things, chances are that the default thinking with these people and yourself will be quite different, right? I mean, especially, let's imagine one is an architect, one is an automotive engineer. Benjamin, one may be a 3D printing person, like you have gone through. You literally see things in very different ways. So the question then becomes, for what we're engaged with here, how do we change our thinking to think of text as a thinking space and XR as a thinking space? A lot of us already do it a lot, especially you, Brandel. But how can we also foster that in others? Because we make a huge amount of assumptions in the community, as we naturally would. But what are the kind of everyday thoughts we need to have to really bring this forward? Any thoughts on that?
Well, so I've read a bunch of things about the history of writing and thinking, and Rob has written a bunch more. A lot of the most prominent stuff is pretty, like at the outset of something like this, is pretty mundane. It's often commercially oriented or otherwise not for the internal edification of people. So if we can hit applications that people have a desire to meet because it makes money, it garners power, these kinds of things are the places where people have the ability to find the most resources, and then being able to kind of pull those little by little toward intellectual tasks is the kind of goal. So yeah, I don't know, the absolute forefront of how people think about things like money and power. Certainly Palantir, for all of its terrible, terrible many flaws. I'm not saying that I'm a fan of Palantir, but it's important for power. Understanding how people actually use those kinds of things and what they get out of it and what that sort of points to in terms of space. Even Palantir itself, though, is not as important a broker of power because most of the people doing it are technicians. So summaries of things from Palantir or other things like that are the most important thing. So instead of getting a PDF printout, getting a space printout, a spatial PDF or whatever that has a timeline or whatever else that you can kind of step through and be like, okay, now, Mr. President or Mrs. President, hopefully,
Yes.
Madam President, as you can see, here are the areas of interest, and if you kind of just do a little pitch note, just with your fingers, twist them a little bit like that. Right. Now you can see what it looks like with the bunker with the roof off. So that's the kind of thing that we need to get after. And once people do that, then you can be like, you can imagine this as missile bunkers for the mind. But yeah, that's that's my take.
So here's the thing. Thank you for that, Randall. I'm going to return to that in 20 seconds. The European Union gave us USB-C as a uniform standard. So a political, not a commercial, because you were talking about commercial interest, Randall. So they gave us that. So the notion of USB-C of knowledge, as in having some standard interconnect things might be useful. But going back to what you said, Brandel, maybe that is so. This year, Benjamin, and thank you for being here. It's very helpful for you being new to help us remind us of things and mini summaries to you. We've been looking at augmenting an academic reader. Maybe this year, and hopefully tomorrow Harris will be voted in, but maybe this year we do exactly what Brandel said. We model what we do of giving a command center to the President of the United States of America. Hopefully it will be her, but maybe Crazy Man gets in, I don't know. But might that be a better thing? Because that can be scaled to anybody doing decisions. It just sounds more dramatic if it's at that level. Okay, President of Paris then, Fabian. I don't know. What do you think of having a specific user in mind like that?
I think it's interesting. Well, the president of Paris, I think there is a mayor of Paris, but anyway, technicalities. I was discussing with.
Oh yeah, the president of Paris is Emily, right?
Well, anyway, I'll just go. I was discussing with that friend about basically empowerment. Again, I do prototyping because it's empowering me. I do it in open source because I hope it might empower others, and I think it's the right way to do it, basically. So here the problem is, I do think it's sexy, but I'm not sure how much of it does translate to I don't want to say normal human being, but an average-ish human being, because it's indeed when, well, don't want to share too much of my life, but I'm watching The Diplomat, which is a interesting TV show, and you see how people also in position of political power age over time. And it's fast, like with basically the higher up the hierarchy you are, the faster the years reflect on your body as you stay there. So it's definitely interesting, definitely sexy. I'm not sure how much it helps us egoistically or at least egocentrically here. So I think it's interesting to think of. I'm not sure I would focus on that first. Having a target user, yes. Having because also let's imagine, like, let's say the president of Paris or the American president or whatnot. They have the tools, yes, and they have in a control room, yes, but they also have staff, like again, a ton of staff that is going to summarize and in a very specific way. It's not just like shitty LLM or whatever. Is they know exactly how they think, they know what kind of format to present. I mean, it is not the same. So the problem, I'm a little bit afraid, like if we do this kind of target user, in terms of how it's going to be used by just us, without the staff and this kind of resources, I don't know. I'm just a little bit skeptical.
Well, the stuff is easy. That'll just be AI. It's all done. Just kidding. Just kidding. Calm down, everyone. Okay, Carl, please.
I will say that in my experience, from what I have observed, user stories are great if you are building a product. User stories are often less helpful if you are doing open-ended research, which I think is closer to what we're doing here. So user stories can give a sort of overarching, specialized, focused vision of how you want the tool or the thing to work or look or sound. But if you're doing open-ended research and trying to say what is a correct way to do this, not the correct way to do this, and then trying to compare and contrast different methodologies for which is better, your user stories can actually get in the way of that. So you may be optimizing something and you may choose between a variety of options that best fits the user story, but that may not be the best from the like piecewise, like lower sort of mechanical level. Over.
That's a very good point. Thanks for that. Benjamin.
Yeah, so I'm coming from here from an outside perspective. So forgive me if I'm ignorant, but from my point of view, it probably makes the most sense to like focus on beta testing and accessibility with likely users. And I also think if you're going to pick like a target user, uh, in all likelihood, the likely user is, someone more technologically advanced and, more likely to adopt this. So maybe focusing on that more will be more beneficial here. Those are just some of my thoughts.
It's a very strong point that because this is research, we should not be overly focused on the ease of use, the entry, the hand-holding. We should accept that the user will have some degree of expertise. I think that's absolutely fair enough. Yeah, good point. Mark?
A couple of things and sort of pick up on some things raised. So I'll go in reverse order. It's interesting. I would say one observation from some decades of working with knowledge tools is although most of the work is mediated by software, technical knowledge does not prove to be an advantage. So technically adept people are, frankly, in my observation, no better than people who are something like pure psychologists. Counterintuitive, but that's just how it appears to roll out. So that's not a negative against the last, but simply an unexpected thing that comes from it. I certainly, and I accord with the thing about sort of user stories and this imagining of what might be, because I think at the early stage when you're doing knowledge work, the key thing is you don't really know what the answers are, and in fact, one of the things you're fighting against is applying your experience in an unuseful way, because part of your brain is saying, no, I know how this works. We don't need to do this. I know the answer. And of course, that's the one thing you're trying to avoid. It's interesting that sort of Palantir got mentioned. One of the things I had, some decade, but actually a while back, it was back when it first came out, reading about it. And one of the things they had to deal with, which most of us don't, which was protection of human sources. So, Madam President or Mr. President might want to know about this thing, but probably doesn't and shouldn't know exactly how that came to be, because that would put people at risk. Your own people or other people. But the whole thing of situational awareness sort of plays back to my early experiential wheelhouse. Doing things in 3D and 3 dimensions, genuinely in the dark with an incomplete picture. And one of the biggest challenges was trying to mesh the certainty of the technology, which was normally incomplete, with the reality that you actually had to deal with, or else people got badly broken. And I think that's worth hanging on to. And I think Fabian's point bears sort of repetition about doing things at too high a scale. I think it's useful to sort of go and look at some of the experiences people have had with things like city dashboards, where a lot of well-intentioned work went into making some things that just proved weird in all sorts of unexpected ways. But you had to build it to get there. But they're either sort of very dystopian, or they just didn't work at all, or they revealed all the wrong sorts of information, or they just plain didn't work, and were essentially a lot of money into a hole in the ground. So I think we want to sidestep all of that. And so circling back, for knowledge work, it is actually at a fairly personal level. So the high, it's sexy to talk about the high level thing, but actually what someone at the presidential level is doing is sitting, as has been said, at the top of a lot of staff who are doing an awful lot of filtering, and one of their jobs is to, at each level, is to triage it down. So it comes down to, Mr. President, you have 5 choices, pick one. And that's not, and actually that's done as a joke in The Simpsons, but in a way that's useful and real, because somebody else has worked out what those 5 things are. But there is a choice, and there's probably some cost or whatever to the choice of that. But that's what a staff does. I think when you're doing knowledge work, you don't want that. You don't want that winnowing too early, because the one thing that removes is the really, really useful ability to just juxtapose stuff, tear it apart, put it together, look for the things you don't know, the things that you think ought to be there but can't find, because the reporting process, the sort of windowing the display process, inevitably nerfs the richness of that picture. Thanks.
The Diplomat, Fabian, is an absolutely brilliant show, especially the scene with the shoes. Anyway, that's an aside. So here's the thing. Mondays are not really about the Sloan, but the Sloan helps give a little bit of direction to our talk. Next year, we're supposed to be working on authorship in XR. And we're widely defining authorship, of course, within text being a primary element of that authorship. But the notion of, okay, so right now, sorry for going a bit all over the place. I use the Vision Pro because I think it's amazing. But it's, of course, early version lacking a few things, like the notion of a memory palace kind of works because you can leave things all over the space. But there's only one app that I've really seen that you can put things on the physical walls of where you are. That is probably coming. There will be competition there. But the notion of being able to have different spaces of knowledge and how those can have different views for different uses may be quite core to what we're talking about. I do believe very strongly that this needs to work in WebXR, and hopefully the vision will be able to have AR pass through and all of that at some point in the web browser. But what is the thinking of, again, going back to Fabian's beautiful pictures from CERN, of how we might start experimenting with using the full physical room we're into thinking? Most of it's probably going to be 2D because otherwise it gets messy. And that's fine. It's still 2D in a 3D environment, but I would love to hear thoughts on dreaming about that if anyone has anything.
So I'll just jump in. Like the messy part to me is actually, as long as it's somehow manageable, it's sexy or it's good. Like, for example, just to reply to Mark in the chat, he shared US 24 proceedings. How I would normally do this is, especially if I don't, well, like in a non-ecological way, just print it all, dump it on the actual floor in front of me, either sit in the middle and then toss them around and say, this is exciting to me, this is not, this is related to that one, I should read that one first, or some kind of triage again. And initially it looks super messy, but then if I do my job right, first, maybe I just discard everything. I don't know, I made a mistake and it's not related to my current goal. And it's okay. Or I pick 2 or 3 papers, and out of those 2 or 3, there is one that I must read first. And then, for example, I'll put it there on my e-ink device or whatever device I need to do the slow and long, let's say, reading. But it means I go from a messy state, which, to be honest, I love. I really like it because then I'm going to try to find structure behind it, and I can use the floor, I can use post-it notes or whatever. But that messy state, to me, is not negative, as long as we do provide the tools and or processes or both to somehow navigate through it and then have some structure. But if there is structure out of the messiness, again, to me, that's brilliant. That's exactly what I'm looking for.
Fabian, you remind me of that cartoon of a scientist in front of a huge blackboard with a lot of equations, and then there's a little bit in the middle that says magic happens here, and then you have the answer. Because to me, what you just said there is the exciting magic needs to happen here a bit. Messy is great, but exactly the big question is how you manage it. And that is what I'm so excited that we've started working on together. And it's so nice for so many of us to be using the headsets, because one of the key constraints that's the one. Carl, that was ridiculously quick. Huh. Thank you. Thank you. That's exactly what I was referring to. Because to say something that's obvious now and kind of was before we started using the headset is, in VR, your world is infinitely huge, but you're stuck on your chair unless you have a special room for it. So any normal office, you can't walk around, you'll bump into things, right? But in AR, you have only the physical room, but you can walk around in it. Right? These are really interesting balances of different affordances for these things. And that really gets into the whole notion of what is messy. Is it messy if you sit still, or is it messy when you move? Benjamin, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that on the whole messy thing. I think it's more like there's an order to the chaos, and probably to the person that has the desk, it's not messy, it's organized in their own way. So I guess all of that messiness is kind of natural to, in a sense. And I guess the key there is being able to manage everything so that you can have, you know, messy desks in XR will be pretty powerful.
Thank you. I just think I need to clarify a little bit what is meant by messy desk in this context. And that is, imagine you have basically your files and your project, all of, you know, beautiful, like Minority Report or whatever style. But then when you go into a section of that, what happens to all the other stuff? If it stays same size, same place, then it's clutter, right? So the way you can kind of push it away a little bit through transparency, size, or lumping it, folding it, that's what we mean. So it's managing what is there, because you still only have, you know, the back of your eyeball to deal with all of this stuff, no matter what it is. So the hiding becomes important, not to reduce messiness, but to reduce the clutter so you can make a useful mess. So I think we're very much on the same page. Brandel, please.
The sort of clarifying and qualifying what a useful mess entails, yeah, I think is really important. And one of the things that I think it needs to be maintained within the mix is that it's incredibly contingent on being reflective of exactly what a person's actual impulse resulted in, and that also things like a little bit of context restoration goes a long way in terms of being able to kind of clarify and qualify a mess. Bill Buxton has a really wonderful sort of description of the way a small child draws a picture and then draws over and over and over. And as they're sort of describing and dictating the things that happen, then they're clarifying that this is rain and this is wind, and it's just scribbles. They're just, you know, terrible artists, and that's fine. They'll grow up, hopefully. Um, but it's the specificity of like this is meant by that, and this happens after that, and that kind of thing. That is exceptionally important. And so it means that there needs to be like any kind of display and control mechanism needs to hew incredibly closely to what it is that people are actually doing and the actions that they're undertaking in order for those to be truly imbued with the full level of meaning that the person has. You know, like there's the art sort of piece 17 Points of Light is about just being able to kind of take these not arbitrary but relatively minimal kind of data points in a sort of a motion capture context and say like I can recognize everybody I know from these different points, and if we transpose the different gates on them and stuff like that, that's because those specifics matter. And so when something becomes messy, on the one hand, like I don't know, it's really lovely to have things that look good, but a lot of the time that curation, that alignment and everything like that comes at a direct cross purpose to the expressive requirements that are incumbent on something in order for that mess to become meaningful. And I think that's a real difficult tension for, you know, companies, especially like, for example, Apple, to be able to kind of contend with, because everybody's real life is super ugly, and again, also not only that, but it's also incredibly contingent. So the moment that you step away from it, then you lose all that context. You lose the capacity to be able to recognize that this icon was like that. And that's super gross, but I kind of meant something by that, or I remember something by that. And that's not to say that the right sort of level of detail and control is for everybody to be able to have full, unconstrained 6 degree of freedom capacity to position their icons, because that would be just a dumpster fire of a user interface. But maybe we need to see. That's all. Yeah. Hopefully that makes sense.
Are you talking a little bit about having something kind of pre-structured to snap to, so to speak, but enough of a level of control that it doesn't control it for you, but that kind of balance?
Yeah, I'm saying that I have no indication that there's even like a safe midpoint on an equilibrium there, and that there's a constant trade-off between those things, and that we need to understand those tensions in order to be able to resolve what the correct what is what not even what the correct, but what we get out of picking different points on it. So sort of the arbitrary arrangement of those things gives us more chance to be able to see meaning, where a template and a formalism just says this is adhering to that template and formalism. It's sort of like the quantitative visual display of things in reference to Grice's maxims. Grice's maxims are the things about communication stipulating that information is complete and appropriate and concise. And so that you're not saying things more than you should. So if you say like, and there's a somewhat crass but funny joke saying like my T-shirt clarifying that I do not have a weird dick is raising more questions than it should be than it really should be. So we need to think about that in the context of the visual display of information as well as funny T-shirts.
Funny T-shirts are great, but yeah, thank you. Mark, and then I have a big question for everyone.
I've just put a link to, I hope it's the right one, right thing. I've just put a link to Grice's maxims in the chat. Yeah, I was just going to, I spotted Carl's point earlier about, ASD, ADHD and ASD and these sort of things. And there is something, I think what that links partly to is also this notion of flow state. Because for some people maintaining, so in other words, it's quite easy to ignore the 4 cups of empty coffee on your desk because you just don't see those. They're part of the messiness. You know they're there. You'd know if somebody moved them, and that probably would disrupt your flow state because that's just unhelpful. You know they're there. You're ignoring them deliberately. And this is a thing I think that's much understood by something that's basically trying to impose order. And the other thing, the reason I really stuck my hand up was I was thinking there was mention again of the that lovely image that Fabian posted of sort of CERN and the blackboards. I think another thing overlooked is the degree of abstraction that's going on there. So it's not only that's a sort of, in a sense, a classically messy desk, but full of things that are not necessarily literal representations of things. They are hints. They're a portal through to whole sort of connected areas of understanding, and that's another thing that I think gets often misunderstood by the literality of a lot of our sort of automated computer-generated systems, because, well, you take that thing and you show that thing and that's the answer. No, that thing is basically a pointer to a myriad of things behind. And this is, I think, one of the things that really is interesting about the knowledge space and where things like view specs really come into play. So there are 2 activities you do. One is you either create or ingest the information that's sort of necessary to the subject you're studying, but then you have it in all sorts of different ways. It's the same data underneath. This is what freaks people out who are used to using essentially a word processor, because how can things move? If I put paragraph 2, second paragraph, that is where it is. If I want to see paragraph 2, I scroll to paragraph 2. Where you show someone a screen and this same information is not only in a different place, but represented in a completely different way, freaks people out at first instance. But actually, my observation is people actually, of all sorts of backgrounds and experience, relax into it pretty quickly once they grok the extra power that it offers them. So going back to the question, I think it was Fred raised, well, how do we expose this to people? I think it's getting people used to the idea of view specs. Call them what we will. I mean, I know it's an old term, one that didn't stick, but there isn't a better one. Well, there isn't another term that covers that at the moment, and maybe there is a better one we can create. But this ability to see the same information in many contexts, and what is inherent in that is most of the things you are seeing are pointed to something else. They are not literal, and I think this is one of the weaknesses of a lot of the notional knowledge tools around at the moment. They're basically just a graph, directed graph, showing you that a box is. All that's in the box is what was in the box at the source. Real knowledge tools go a level beyond that, and they assist us in the associative thinking that we're really good at. I'll stop there. Thanks.
So Benjamin, Ted Nelson is, if you're interested in this field at all, Ted Nelson is definitely someone to talk to. What happened? Did we just lose someone? Screen went funny. Randall said he had to go, but Rob. Rob had to go as well. Right. Anyway, sorry about that. That was weird. So Doug Englebart's also someone worth looking at for sure. He had a notion of view specification. That's what Mark meant by view spec, so that you can choose to see the same information in different ways. So I have a one level up question for you guys, and that is, it seems to me that in most science fiction, aliens have autism, right? They are very logical. And it's mostly the humor that they take things literally, right? I think that's quite ridiculous. Why would we assume, because it's again and again and again. Do you agree with that premise that that's what it seems like, or am I being mad, first of all? Name a non-autistic alien, Mark. As in, please, not as in a provocation, like, oh no, I don't agree with you. Oh, you muted.
Sorry, it's that's definitely, you know, I didn't load that tape, you know, Matrix load me up with my sort of crappy science fiction. No, and I'm not seeking to take a sort of binary opposition. I'm not I don't know. I don't actually think it's quite that case. I mean, you're right. There are often cases where people are thought to be very logical, but I'm not sure it's very logical. I think what they're often because you can play this trick when you're writing a story is the aliens are often gifted with a capability of sort of producing knowledge, sort of fully formed at a speed and a depth that we can't. And I think you may be conflating that with autism. And I know you mean that, and also you mean no ill by that. But I mean, yeah. But I actually find that no, I think across the piece they do all sorts of things. They mainly do things that we don't do, and that's why they're weird and different.
Yeah, but no, I agree with that. But one of the things that's kind of annoying, and I think relates to our discussion, is that very often the humor is they take things literally, right? It comes up again and again. And because they quote unquote lack the humanness of it. So what I'm really meaning to throw out here is if we are out to augment the human, what are we trying to augment? Of course, it's problem solving. Of course, it's aspects of that. But which direction of humanness are we really talking about?
Well, just one thing I'd note on the sort of literality part is, of course, that there's a difference between someone who's a well-trained, in a sense, you know, knowledgeable, accomplished speaker of the same language as me, who just doesn't appear to get something that's generally held to be a norm, as opposed to me going to China and not understanding the jokes because I don't speak much Chinese. So there's a danger of conflating the two there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. And Carl wrote something similar in the comments. Thankfully now hello Claude, how are you? The Claude summary does take into account our chat, so that's good. But yeah, the point is, as we talked about recently, and as Brandel has gone on about quite a while ago, is there aren't that many kind of processes going on in the human brain, right? When you look at it, it's a bit scary. You have things that are focused on what's going on in the outside world, what's going on inside your body. There are all these things, and our knowledge of understanding of actual human thoughts is abysmally small. Yeah, Carl is making the gesture of small. It's absolutely freaking scary. And as I wrote in thank you, Brandel. What did you say? Oh, okay. Well, we can't hear anything because you're muted. But fair enough. The power of
AirPods
muting.
do a good job as well, but yeah. See, I'll be back if I can be, but I doubt it.
We can't even hear any background when you speak, even when you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
The system works. Yeah.
it really does. So what I wrote in the dedication to this future of text is I dedicated it to my teachers because I got my PhD this summer. And what I wrote was something kind of obvious, but quite useful, and that is getting a PhD doesn't mean you know more stuff about things in general. It means you know more stuff about something really, really tiny, right? And one of the things it really helps to bring home emotionally is the absolute vastness of one's own ignorance, as I'm sure you all agree with in this group, right? We are severely narrow-minded, ignorant creatures running on prejudice. We have to be. And when we were living in a jungle that didn't change much, that was important and that was useful. So if we're really truly talking about using symbols to augment our thinking and communication, it has to relate to these limitations, right? Of overcoming them. So a lot of this is obvious, like people say, oh, use AI to come up with a counter argument to what you've written and all of that kind of stuff. But other than just using another brain, either human or artificial, and I use the term brain very loosely, what are the systemic things we might consider looking into?
So I'm going to nitpick a little bit because you did say that you use the term brain very loosely, but I think it's really dangerous to do so. There is, I'll share it eventually on the chat, but there is a paper from a Dutch professor, I forgot the name, but they were basically saying we need to reclaim the term mind or artificial mind for cognitive science or philosophy of the mind, and because it's being watered down for marketing of AI and LLM at the moment, which again they have like the goal of building system, AGI and whatnot, which per se is intellectually interesting. I'm not questioning this. I do question if it's feasible at all, but anyway, that's another topic. But the point is, if we move the goalpost or if we change the definition to the point that they reach their goal and say, hey, we passed that benchmark or whatnot, it doesn't mean whatever they did is not useful or doesn't serve some kind of goal. But so far, I mean, it's honestly ridiculous to compare the mind, like a human-made mind, biological mind, of what can be done and anything that's been built. It's honestly it's shameful to do that. It's like conceptually speaking, we get that we're trying to build a mind, but any kind of comparison is like if you take like any random, like a very young human, couple of years old, can do things that are just unreachable in any kind of deduction with like billions of dollar machine that take the amount of energy that entire cities need. It's just ridiculous. But the point is not really this. The comparison itself is that when you move the goalpost to the point of saying, "Hey, I tick that box. We're doing an amazing job. Pat us on the back, and then give us more money." Again, you forget what even a dog, not even a human, can do. Like some pets, like they're very smart, and whenever the comparison is done to the point that we forget how smart we are, it's really it's dangerous. Like we forget. And I'm not saying like, oh, we here people in this group are pretty smart and cultured and whatnot. I'm saying a random human being can do amazing things. So whenever we forget this because we're repeating some kind of marketing argument around AI, it's dangerous because we lower ourselves. And I don't think we should do this. So sorry to nitpick. I'll put the paper in the chat. But I think it's like some kind of semantic drift we need to really be mindful of.
Mindful. Perfect ending of that. Mindful, exactly. Okay, this is really important because being whatever, I would automatically argue that point with you for the sake of arguing it, which is a bit reactive and a bit stupid. Now, first of all, there's a great book by Nick Chatter called The Mind is Flat, which really goes to illustrate that we are not deep logical thinkers most of the time, not that we should be. It's a great little book, tiny book. Now, I think using LLMs, AIs, and all of this are really, really important, which is why I'm investing in this super Mac that's going to be available in a month, because we have to experiment with it. But I really would like to underline, not undermine you, Fabienne, by saying that there is a difference, and we are, as a whole, quite ignorant of what the difference actually is. And to really understand the abilities and limitations of the human and the system will be really, really important if we're going to get something useful out of it. You know, it's fair enough, the whole argument of LLMs are dangerous for many reasons. I completely agree. And that's done. We've done that, and many other people are doing it. But in the community, how is it really different and how can we use it is very much a springboard, I would say, from what you said. Mark, and then Fabienne, you can take your hand up to agree with me.
I think it's interesting what you're saying, and I was mindful of Carl's comment there, which is just basically saying, well, if we if we could accurately replicate human thought, we'd be any further forward. And I think that's actually a very pertinent. No, I think that's actually a very pertinent observation, because I think one of the problems at the moment is that we tend to sort of try and think of human thought in terms of technology we have, i.e., sort of computers. So, it's the man with a hammer, everything is a nail. To a certain extent, working out what a mind is, it involves getting a very big hammer and hitting the nail very hard, but possibly to no good event. I mean, it's not deliberately misguided. It's just that we don't necessarily have the tools. I mean, one of the interesting things is that as you start to go out into other disciplines, and I don't claim to be massively widely read across the piece, but the way that people talk about the mind and thought uses decidedly non-technical, hard-edged software sorts of terms. But we don't have software that can do that. So that's another problem. So in other words, part of the issue is our tools are just not encompassing enough of some of the tasks we want to do. So we may need to think of an elegant way to step over that barrier by saying, well, how can we maybe do things by proxy using the tools we have, explicitly, not by trying to make the reality fit the tool that we've got, but just saying, how can we, in essence, make the tool that we have a proxy indicator for something that we can't totally express.
Just getting this PDF from. Yeah, thank you for that. I will definitely look at that, Fabienne. But just making sure it has the right metadata, obviously, which I can't easily. Right. Kind of looking at in the chat here, if it was exactly the same as human brain, these synthetic things, what value would that be? It would have some value, but it would be different from, and let's at least call it an intelligence in the loose sense, right? And because there's a lot of pedestrian things we can do. Already these conversations are transcribed pretty damn well. One of the prompts is, what were the agreements and disagreements? And going through it, yeah, it pretty much nails it. So it does if we use the term intelligence, Claude, which is what we use for this, as any person who's performing a secretarial task, whatever their education or intelligence might be, it does that job admirably in about 2 minutes. So for the pedestrian level, that's fine. Of course, we're concerned about misinformation, hallucinations, all of this stuff. Of course we are, as we should. Now, working on our timeline for our book, I've added a little bit on the LLM revolution over the last few years, and I came across Bloom, which I didn't know about, which is a European massive LLM for science, which is very interesting. So that and Llama is probably what will be interesting to experiment on. And the thing is, as with any media, let's call LLMs a media, another loose term, we have to decide for what. I mean, the fact that these things can do anything from a drawing to a video to a research paper to proofreading to a dialogue it means that our discussion can become useless. I'm not saying it is today, absolutely not. But discussions on AI, everybody can be talking about a different aspect of it, right? So I hope that as we're moving into more and more XR work, we can also, thank you, Fabian, that's a great link. We will decide more on what aspects and what types of LLM we're talking about, and at the same time we're trying to define for what user and what scenario. And we already have a user in mind, we've always had, and that is quite simply someone who's trying to improve how they think, how they learn critically, and how they communicate more clearly. That's the user, but that's pretty boring. So that's why I was half-jokingly suggesting a top political person, because you would expect that person to have agents, human generally, to make decisions.
So one thing I do find interesting about the all the cool new tools is what's always seems to be missing is any validation. So, I suppose that's what my comment in the chat, and it's definitely not meant in a sort of in a negative way. I think it's a very natural reaction. One looks at someone and says, okay, that's sort of good enough. But what is good enough? The thing is, the bridge is good enough until it falls down, is one of the sort of things we've touched on before. What's really interesting in the current way that we're taking these new tools to sort of basically fill in the gaps for us is that what seems to be emerging is that quality is, well, could I do it as well in the same time? So in fact, it's not a quality assessment at all. It's about how much free time have I saved. And I don't think it's intentional. I think it's just quite natural, and even the people who aren't particularly tailorist in their approach, would like to save some time to, even if it's just to sit and watch more TV or whatever. But it is potentially problematic because we've got an awful lot of people producing output, and we've got an awful lot of people not actually looking at the output. They're all saying, "Yeah, it's fine for me. Not my problem, but I'm sure somebody else will look at this." And that's quite worrying because the speed and the volume of the stuff we're using is going along, and this takes back to something I think back to situational awareness as it meant in my early working career, and that would scare the bejesus out of me. Because I look at these things and I have just no idea. They look vaguely grammatical. They look all right. They look vaguely like what I remember. But the only way I can really tell is to actually sit down and look at the whole thing, because there is actually no trust quantum attached to it. And the best I can do is to maybe say to somebody else, I think I'll take their judgment on it. It's a challenge because I don't think it's easy to do. I do think it's sad that the sort of software community, as it were, that all those doing AI have decided to outsource that whole problem to somebody else because they just don't think it's sexy or it doesn't make money. But for us as a whole and for society, and certainly for doing sense making and knowledge making work, it's actually really, really important. One of the things the first thing I look for when papers are taking a vast amount of data, the first thing I look for is how do they clean the data? And the answer is they normally don't. It's just assumed. It's just assumed it's there because surely somebody else would have done that. I mean, why would they make it available at all? Well, yeah, exactly.
Okay.
But it is, so this is something that I think we need to be conscious of as we wrap these tools into our work.
Yes. Yeah, no, I'm obviously very familiar with that point, but you brought a lot of things. MP3s were successful even though they were lower quality than what came before, simply for the convenience. So that's a nice little thing there. The steel plow, as we mentioned at the beginning, it decreased the amount of time to till soil, something phenomenal. So saving time matters a lot. For us to have a transcript of all of these calls using a human, even if we could afford to, would be a massive overhead, right? It's 2 hours twice a week for years. So the fact that the machine can do it, even if the quality is not always getting every nuance, which it won't, but it gets it pretty good. But also, speed is not always a line. It can also be binary. For instance, when you cross a certain threshold, for instance, if you show up one picture, then a slightly different one, and then a slightly different one, and so on. At a certain point, you have a movie, which is a completely different medium from still images. Similarly, with the LLMs we have today, if our computers were a bit slower, like 5 years ago, we couldn't run them, right? So I really think that means something, that the speed changes something. It is not just about, I can do this quicker, and therefore I can have 2 cups of coffee and go to the bathroom more, and that kind of stuff, right? So when you're talking, yeah, they were also free. But before that, it wasn't really reasonable to be able to download music tracks. They were too big. But which is anyways, similar point. But so Mark, what I'm saying is you seem to come from validating AI interactions very much on analysis and summaries and that kind of AI work. That is one type of AI work. There's also a lot of other functions which have very different quality metrics attached to them, right?
Yes, I mean, I don't think I don't come to it from analysis direction. I come to it from a trust direction. I mean, genuinely, it's a trust thing. The fact that I've got something that is potentially usable, that I can use with no effort to do something else, is a massive trust slip. And if you think about secure systems, it's just the kind of thing that you don't want to do. Yes, click through. Do you want to sign in or not? Yes or no? I'll click no.
But Mark, just so we don't go, because Fabian's got his hand up and got lots of other things. Specifically, where are you okay with? Okay, let's forget LLM. Let's just talk about AI in general. You're okay with using AI for a lot of different things, right?
Sure, and where AI works is where the knowledge is where the space is known. So, for instance, a lot of image recognition or sort of data recognition of known patterns, it works really well because the sort of decision space is bounded, known, and understood, and the work can be done faster and probably and often more accurately than a human. Given that we don't even understand our own language, our own language construction ourselves, the idea that a probabilistic 8-ball is going to do it better than us is hubris of the extreme. So we're getting really good stuff, but the genuine challenge for us, and it's not because I'm against this or in some sort of philosophical thing, but it goes back to trust. Can I actually trust the quality of what's out there? Because essentially, I accept the low standards that I work. I endorse and accept the low standards that I walk past without comment. So if I take something that is decidedly subpar or worse, dangerous, and use it, I am responsible.
Mark, so sorry, Fabian, just another minute on this. You use terms like probabilistic 8-ball, which is a very skewed, very emotional term, right? But if we look at the history of the human species before AI, we've had other humans we needed to rely on, and other humans don't always recollect things perfectly also. So the notion of trust, the notion of provenance, the notion of angle, the notion of skew, the notion of perspective, the notion of leaving something out, the notion of adding something is as old as we are, right?
Yeah, but it doesn't alter the point is it doesn't alter the trust. You could trust the village seer, the village
to an extent.
To an extent. And yes, I'm just trying to say that trusting the AI is really difficult because you have absolutely, or you tend to have very, very little in a take it or leave it. I mean, I can't express it more clearly.
No, but Mark, we spend quite a bit of time coming back to this issue in this forum, and I think it's kind of a done discussion because a lot of people are looking at the trust issues of AI. It is a very important issue. But when it comes to a lot of it, it is useful again, we have to decide on the extent and the use. I mean, for instance, for our own transcripts, which are available to all of us in Slack every single week, we can go back and have a sense of how good it is. And if something is missing, we can add to it. So I don't think anybody here saying LLMs or AI, whatever, are perfect. Absolutely not. And I agree with you, we don't necessarily know where it slips. But for a very good use case, for us to be able to go back through the year to do a keyword search, for instance, of when Mark Anderson mentioned Ted Nelson, and then we have links to the video, it ain't that bad. Right, Fabian, quick.
That's fine, but the thing is, again, this is the problem. I'm not arguing against that because that's broadly correct. That'd be the odd mistake, but broadly that sort of thing's quite correct. But there are wider things. Well, I'm not just sure that the encapsulation is right, and I don't think there are people looking at this particularly, and therefore we have to do it to accept. But I mean, I think this is sterile. There is a difference of view here.
Yeah, there is a difference of view, but if we were doing this 30, 40 years ago, we would be talking about the BBC, the New York Times. We would be talking about, can we really trust them? Right? It's different, but it's very, very related. So there has to be an informed judgment as to what degree we feel, there has been studies recently on LLMs turning out to be more politically on one side than the other based on the data that goes into them. They're worthwhile things, absolutely. But I think we should just be very careful with the brushes we painted with. Fabian, quick, before Mark.
No rush. So being useful is not equivalent to thinking. We can think and it can be useless, and we can have things that are done to our discussion and whatnot that are not based on any kind of thinking. So again, to go a little bit back to the paper mentioned and how we should not underestimate what human thinking is, because that's the only form of thinking I think we know. We need to be cautious. It's not because we get a useful transcript that there is any thinking done by anything but any human. Again, it doesn't make any point about the usefulness of the outcome, but just about thinking itself. I also want to share, I don't know if some are probably familiar with it, but there is a competition on lossless compression. So there is an AI researcher, old school, like before LLM, a couple of decades ago, but on compressing basically Wikipedia just as a source of new knowledge, it could be something else, because his principle of one of his, I mean, the motivation is in there, but is intelligence probably use to some extent compression? Like we need some form of way to manipulate information efficiently, and for this we need to be able to, let's say, distinguish signal from noise. So I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but I hope you get the idea. So it is interesting to consider this. It is interesting also to consider the progress, how that loops back also to truthiness or truthfulness or veracity and or the lack of it, is that they were talking about lossless compression, so that what you get in after processing it one way and then the other is what you'll get back. There are no noise injected. There is no way to make a wrong statement, let's say, about it. So I think it's also interesting to consider intelligence and the relation to compression. And well, yeah, there are, okay, to briefly go back, because also I'll have to go in a couple of minutes, about truth itself. So there were different domains, and for example, there were truth about perception of art or the social domain, etc. And for example, there is truth about engineering and the bearing load of a building. For me, at least, that has not a truth that can be challenged the same way as a viewpoint about the history of art and or like the perception of a piece of art. So there are even mathematical truths, etc. It doesn't mean the knowledge itself is fixed forever, but there are ways to evaluate within a certain domain of knowledge if something is truthful or not. So yeah, anyway, link in there.
As I'm going to have to disrespectfully take a different perspective on that, and that is, I feel truth is one-dimensional. Truth is almost like faith. It is often something in and of itself. However, even in engineering and load-bearing is not one thing. Load-bearing is an effect of the environment that the structure is in terms of temperature, wind, shear force, other buildings, load, lots of different things, right? And you could say that each one of those can be assigned a truth. I think that's fair enough. Also, there is such a thing as a lie. Of course there is. There's a mistruth. There's all these other things happen. But I think it is a bit overly simplistic to look for truths. I mean, I don't know if you remember recently, Sacha Baron Cohen did this American tour where he talked to lots of right-wingers and he didn't have a library. He had a truth brewery, not a lie, but a truth brewery, right? I think that was kind of funny. But if we look for truth, we don't need view specs. This is really, really important. So when I was in the great institution of Syracuse University, as I think I've told many of you many times, one of the professors, still don't remember his name, said that truth kills creativity. Once something is established as truth, you cannot question it. Right? This is true. So I think we need to absolutely look out for things going skew-whiff and that are bad, no question. But we need to constantly look for the view specs and the dimensions and how to deal with them. I think that's important. Yes, Fabian, your riposte, please.
No, but I'll have to go in 1 minute. But so first, I think there were truth. But at the very least, there is state of the art of different knowledge domains. There might not be a complete consensus, but within a certain domain, a domain has certain rules to evaluate the quality of the work, and it is some perspective if you want, but there is a state of the art of it, and it's not something like anybody can come and join any domain of knowledge and say whatever they want, however they want. So it means if somebody, and it's strange to me, for example, that you even say this, because I think you're quite attached to, for example, having PDF as a representation of how an author wanted perspective to be shared and it to remain untouched. So it's important that, let's say, when a signal is sent by an author, it is unmodified. It doesn't mean it is true, but at least that the message at the very least cannot change, so that it can be then discussed or challenged, etc. Again, to compared to, I don't know, the state of the art of knowledge on that domain or anything, but it has to be the actual thing that was said before. Otherwise, if we change whatever was said to attack it, it doesn't even make sense to go on.
Fabian, it is not about the author portraying a truth. It is about the author being able to clearly express their perspective. So I'm not saying the PDF or whatever is a truth. The veracity of claims needs to be checked, and also the authenticity of did the author actually say this is very important. But even when you come into those domains of the state of the art, one thing is power plugs. Power plugs in this country have to be this far off the ground, right? Because of flooding and whatever. That is the law. That's what our builders thought. And then I go to Norway and they're this far off the floor. And I actually asked our friend who was an electrician, it's like, doesn't have to be this. Isn't that a European regulation? He said, no, that's been repealed decades ago. Right? So the point is that even when you come to something within engineering that seems to be A plus B, it is A plus B according to. There's always an according to the latest testing. And as you said, according to the state of art in India, or the state of the art in medical science, right? So that's why I think perspective and view is really important to determine let's agree on the term, because you're going to go the truthfulness as opposed to truth. How's that? Is that a compromise?
Sure, it's a compromise. I wanted to, I think in most knowledge, at least scientific knowledge, then we state our requirements. We state like what is the basis of what are the different assumptions. And I think making them explicit does indeed allow to say, hey, that is for the code within that, I don't know, regulation within that space of, let's say, Norway versus somewhere else. So it's again, like we need coherence within the same domain. Otherwise, it's kind of pointless.
Coherence is a great term. On that note, you're free to go, man. Coherence is really useful. And I see what Carl also wrote here. Yeah. So we've gone into discussing what truth is. Great. Yeah, you don't want electricity on the floor, Mark. Absolutely. Yes, Mark.
Yeah, I was going to say, yes, Helena used to come around in her gumboots because she just didn't trust us students to keep plugs in at all time. And she didn't want to get electrocuted by walking into such a room. Anyway, yeah, I mean, I think sort of that's sort of truth is a charged word. I mean, there is a sort of consensus view within a domain normally about what is held to be a common, a sort of common, in a sense, you could say a common standard. So that, things within that domain broadly would be expected to conform with, avoiding the T word, that thing. Of course, as time goes forward, we learn other things, and if they are in the sciences empirically proved and in the humanities sufficiently argued, that changes our perception of where that ground lies. I think it's subtly different from trust, which is something what it purports to be. And you're absolutely right that we've always had this argument. One of the problems is that we're probably better at judging our trust in a sort of human or an institution of humans than we are in a bit of data spewed out by a computer, simply because we just don't have hundreds of years of experience. It doesn't mean we're necessarily worse, but we are definitely ill prepared for it. So basically, we're producing more stuff about which we need to make objective trust judgments in a context where we're ill prepared for it, and that to me is the nub of the issue. It's not about bad things or people deliberately doing bad things. It is the challenge Because the difficulty is that, one of the reasons we use these things is the only way really to check them is to go back and do the original. And you realize why you did this extract in the first place, because it saved you a boatload of time and perhaps use, tools or skills that you don't have. So one of the challenges to us is to think how we construct some sort of a trust structure on that, which is not as simple as pure sort of algorithmic provenance. Like, yes, it went through this system at this time, it will change from this form to that form. That's useful to know, but that doesn't actually still tell you whether the transform that happened was, in essence, something you can trust, and that itself is subjective, and that's why it's really difficult. And so I know I'd probably get painted as someone who's sort of against these things. Actually, not at all. I'm just constantly mystified by how you work through this trust issue, because house built on sand is not a good proposition, and all too often I'm sort of quite shocked that when you actually go down to do the structural survey, you find that there is absolutely nothing at the bottom.
Right. So you made some great points there. Trust and truth is not the same. And of course, proven means testing, which is why we have proving grounds in the military. And one thing I should have mentioned when Fabian was here, science has to be falsifiable, otherwise it's not science, it's faith. So that's kind of important. When it comes to what happens inside the LLMs, I think it's a little bit outside of our remit for now. I do accept that they are not God-given truth, so to speak. And I desperately look forward to being able to run local LLMs to learn how to do a bit of training and all of that good stuff, and to get a feel for it. The reason I think of Art and Jackson Pollock in particular is that he was literally painting with an uncontrolled brush. So if we keep in mind that LLMs are a bit of an uncontrolled brush, and as you pointed out before, Mark, the end user needs to be more aware of the limitations, and not only limitations, but the skewing that can happen. That would be important. But as with text, as we're talking about the spaces, I do have a dream of being able to have this discussion in a multi-dimensional space, where we can tear apart these things, we can move them about. And I look forward to getting into more discussions about that, of, how do we, the information we're looking at, with the argument we're having, if you have one LLM here that I've made, or trained rather, Mark has another one here, we can start pulling at them and see where our differences are of the argument. That kind of situations will be interesting. I believe you shared a paper on something like that, Mark, not that long ago, of how trying to analyze based on weighings might be quite useful.
Sorry, I'm spacing on that. I just a thought occurred to me, of course, if Jackson Pollock painted photorealistic paintings, rather than, these very abstract ones. So if I look at a Jackson Pollock, I think, okay, this is fairly abstract. I'm not supposed to take a particular meaning away from this. But if the same artist with the same intent had painted something that was, beautifully photorealistic picture of New York, it might be harder to actually make that same judgment.
I just pasted in the link that you shared, Mark.
Oh, yes. Okay. So Richard Brath actually.
It's worth clicking on, everyone, if you just visually want to look at it while Mark is talking. It's
the guy also actually. Sorry, CRC are one people who really seem to control their book prices very much. This is quite interesting by Richard Brath. He basically, I think essentially it's the book of his recent doctorate. But he's done some really interesting stuff, and it is about the sort of interconnection of text with visualization, and he continues to write a blog. So folk might find that interesting. I'll put a link. Sorry, I'll make an Amazon link. Obviously, other vendors are available, but for the book.
Do you have contact information from him, Mark? I can't easily see it.
No. He might be. He did a. was it University of South London? It might be trackable via the university where he studied.
Could you
He
please
does have a
look into that?
blog. That's the book. 1 second, it's in my RSS feeder.
Yeah, the blog doesn't seem to have a front page, so to speak.
No, the answer is no, I don't then. Well, we can see if we can find something. But anyway, he's done some interesting stuff. I mean, the interesting thing I found when I was sort of looking at the blog, which I sort of shared with Freud, but I left me thinking, okay, waiting's great, but waiting's based on what? I mean, it is an inexorable problem. But that, I think, is why the whole area of sort of knowledge tools and sort of tools for thought is really interesting, because this is where you actually stop leaning directly on tools working as a proxy for your thought. And where they work correctly is where, instead of doing what is our norm with software, where you ask it, which button do I have, what do I put in what box to press which button to get the output, which is sort of how it's not deliberate, but in a sense that's our tends to be our sort of default approach, because broadly we have these tools to do things for us, but they are normally specified for a particular thing. When you go the other way and you want to do very open-ended stuff, what you want is, you do want a toolbox. Say, okay, I need to make one of these. I'm going to need some screws. I'm going to need a saw. I might need a monkey wrench. And you take it as you go and you build it out. But in other words, you remain open to the thinking that all the time, am I building out the right thing? Okay, no, maybe I need to back up, and I need a different view spec. I need to view this in a different way. And what that causes you to do is to think all the time about basically the information that sits underneath it. You can think of it in data. If you're a data person, you can just think of it as text, stuff you wrote. If that's sort of how you tend to react with text. Both are equally valid, but with the sort of thinking space, and I think where I remember when we first started talking about XR, and my mind immediately flew to being able to basically deconstruct text into either information directly in it or metadata about it, information that I've made about the text that enabled me to say, show me all the bits that have this or that or the other, and do them in an open and plastic space, which is something spatial hypertext has been doing since the mid-80s. And this is the paper I've now to condemn myself to write for Freud. But it's very strong.
So in the closing minutes, let's make this a bit more exciting for Benjamin. And how about we try to talk a little bit more about spatial hypertext, good timing, Mark, and how structures of text might work in XR. Anybody have any thoughts? I know Mark does. Anyone else have any first? Okay, well, let me ask Benjamin then, first of all, while we all think about that. Coming into this community really fresh and just having the notion of the future of text, putting on a headset and stuff, how would you, with the best possible way, relatively naively think about what that might be? What would be your dreams?
I'd have to think about that for a second, but very naively, well, something that right now kind of gets to me is I really don't like reading textbooks on monitors, just because I find it's harder to read on a monitor than on a physical book. So I think, and I think a lot of people can agree with this. I think, and it seems kind of counterintuitive, but I think getting text and other things to a medium where it's more natural to read and interact with is a big thing, because I find it a lot easier to flip through a book than to go through a PDF, even though I've been reading PDFs for 16 years or something. Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just making text more natural to use. And then ideally, if you can do this with computers, you can leverage a lot of things with searching. So it's very easy to search on a PDF, but you can't do that with a book. So there are trade-offs between the two. So, in the perfect world, you have the natural sense of what you can do with books, and then you augment that with tools that can be used with computers.
Many in our community, including myself, do prefer to read on paper. I read most, I got rid of a lot of books when the iPad came out, and then I had to buy a lot of books. So there's no question about that. And yes, the navigation features of digital text, find search being one of them, is important. And the reason we talk a lot about view specs in this community is that just reading columns of text is dreary, especially when it's projected light onto you. So the text better be amenable to having different layers of what you can read. We're looking a lot into what we sometimes call the library level, where you have many documents, to see how they connect, see snippets in them, metadata and all of that, and have that be available. So when you're out of the headset or out of the laptop, you can then know what you want to read, what some people call deeply or slowly, meaning the same thing, at least in the literature, and being able to go back and forth. The notion of so here's the thing, even though the future of text is my thing, I definitely think that most of this future of text should be less text. Make it higher quality and a higher quality reading experience for sure.
There was a point that got brought up, sort of in a place contingent this by Fabian, that was sort of interesting, and it's sort of difficult because everything's moving at the moment. The environment's getting better, the tools are getting better. But one of the sort of things that he raised, and which I would have a degree of sympathy for, is that as things stand at the moment, however much I may want to do the sort of deeper reading in basically a manufactured environment, be it 2D or 3D, and this is echoing Benjamin's point, is that probably one of the most useful things now is to be able to do this sort of exploration stuff. So what you're actually doing is you're sort of skim reading. You're basically working out: do I need to go and read this, or need to read that, or not at all? Now, where you read it actually is a matter of choice. If you really want, if you're keen and you like the environment as it is even now, that's fine. You can do that. I mean, the tools to move around this is the whole area that we're involved in making at the moment. My gut feeling is, for the broader number of people, its utility, and therefore its likelihood of uptake, is that you go into these you can go into, and it's sort of like an XR space, to explore the relationship of texts, to know why you then want to read this one as opposed to that one. So it's connected with reading, but the deeper reading, if we're going to call it that, but it's a separate activity, which is actually useful because I think it makes it easier in terms of designing stuff. So we're not trying to build one thing that beats as it sweeps as it cleans. That may be possible in the future, but I just think it's difficult now. There are all sorts of things, and as we know, sort of, well, Fabian's not here, but Andrew can certainly attest this. Even things like just focus and selection are a little bit harder than we sort of imagine. In our mind's eye, yeah, easy, you can do it. Actually doing it with even the tools we have turns out to be, a tad more difficult. It will get better, but certainly something that I think has tractability at the moment is using things like XR spaces to do this triage reading, for want of a better term, that people do a lot, be it for academic work or for work generally. It probably has a different use, I would suspect, if you were doing more creative work. If you were writing a novel or something. It's not to say it has no purpose. I am far from it. And as ever, I'm sure that the artistic end of the sort of the overall spectrum will continue to provide interesting provocations by using things in ways we didn't think, or to make associations we didn't think to make.
Yeah. So, and even obviously interrupt me if there is anything on the previous questions, but let me ask you this as another provocation for the last 10 minutes. Let's say we manage to have some fundamental breakthrough, do something really cool, produce an actual system that is usable by people, that allows them to author in a whole new way, author primarily with text, putting down their thoughts, intentions, how it relates to the world and so on, in a spatial environment, and we show it to friends in exactly a year's time. What kind of thing would you like to show, or what kind of effect would you like to have it on your friend?
think one of the biggest tech revelations, and most of us can sort of attest to this, is the first time we used an LLM where it gave us something we didn't expect it to be able to give us. So we said, we're testing it, we're using it, we're learning how it works, we're seeing it has limitations, we're seeing it can make stuff up, we're seeing it has flaws. And we ask it a question, be like, well, maybe it'll know this, maybe it won't, but I severely doubt it's going to be able to do this. And then it does, and it's right. And that sort of pulls the lever of our opinion of the tool back in the other direction of, okay, well, maybe, this thing does have its flaws, it does have its limitations, but there's still use, this thing still has value. And there's more to probe, there's more to find, there's more to look at, because what's easily observable on the surface is not all there is to it. And I think that sort of moment, that sort of aha moment from puzzle game design, as they kind of call it, is something we would want author or our tool to bring out in our users. We want them to start using it and go, oh, this is neat, this is kind of cool, I like the aesthetics, I like the UX, the workflow is neat. There needs to be that moment where they find something, or it has a feature that really makes them reconsider some of the basic assumptions they have about how they are using that tool and what they're using it for.
That sounds gloriously unachievable, and I love it.
I guess to kind of go off that point, I mean, I had a very similar experience using OpenAI and just asking a bunch of questions, and I found it's super useful to me. So much so that I use it pretty much on a daily basis, for work or school or many other things. And I think, not just AI, but I think one of the best successes is for technology to be used consistently with widespread adoption. So I think if you show it to someone and they think it's cool, I think that's one thing. But if you show it to someone and they think, this is really useful, I could see myself using this, every day. I think that's like the end goal, which is, the best you can get with the technology.
I think that is a very strong point. We are, however, a research group, so we should probably aim to push beyond, so that it may be too much, but learn from that and communicate that to others. But in terms of what should ideally come out of this, that's beautifully put.
I've got one that's a sort of problem of today, really, and it's not something I've thought to even sort of try and look at. But one problem when writing a sort of linear output, which is still where a lot of our communication is the above the fold problem of the news article. What do you put first? So in other words, it's staging. It's difficult, even if you know a subject really well and you're trying to introduce it, is working out how much and in what order you need to expose the underlying argumentation to the story you're telling. It's not even if you're sort of selling something, you're just describing something, even that's maybe uncontroversial, but you're trying to describe it to somebody else who doesn't have the knowledge that you do. So I think that's quite an interesting one I'd sort of like to do that, because it feels like it's something that can deal with something software can do, like make graphs and work out actually, it's to untangle a graph. And I suspect often it can't be done. And then the question comes, so what do you do? What do you actually do with the non-untangleable graph?
Yeah, good point. Andrew, Chris, I'm going to ask you both, starting with you, Chris. What would you like to, when somebody puts a headset on, experiences and takes it off? I can see Andrew's got his thinking head on, thinking face. I mean, Carl and Benjamin have pointed out really, really interesting aspects. If you second that, that's fine. But if you have a different aspect too, that's also totally cool.
I think something that would help people connect better in groups, communities. That's something maybe we don't talk as much about.
Oh no, Andrew's leaving. Okay, Andrew, other than people saying to you, oh my God, you made that, any other single or multiple words before you run? Sorry, Chris, getting back to you.
I feel bad cutting Chris off here.
No, no, Chris will continue after you.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing that I always hope for when someone puts on the headset, not even with my experience, but a first time user, I want it to feel um, special in some way. And a lot of times new users just get confused and it's like the worst first experience. Not a lot we can do with that because that's kind of a headset disorientation thing. Can't figure out what buttons do, don't understand how hand tracking works, like keep putting their hands all over the trackers on front of the headset. I think it's just something that will go away with time. Same as how like a mouse for a computer didn't make sense when it was first sort of released to people, and now it's second nature.
Good point. Thank you, Andrew. See you later. Oh, he's gone. Fair enough. Chris, please continue. I apologize for that.
All good. I mean, honestly, I haven't done as much thinking about the VR aspects. Maybe partly because I have not experienced as much other than like a crappy like Google Cardboard, viewer or something a decade ago. The I'm not sure. I think AR probably excites me more because I think it has more direct social applications that would be immediately meaningful to people just in everyday interactions. But
So, Chris, you haven't been using a headset for a while, then you got to put one on. It is surprisingly different because even today, when I was writing an article for the book, I decided to write a trip report, so I wrote it in the headset. And even though it's a rectangle here, when it's in a fake environment versus real environment, there's a huge amount of kind of real world differences that are a bit surprising. One of them is being in VR. It's very easy to feel like you want to know what's going on. But then again, when you are in AR, you're kind of limited by the space you're in. So these trade-offs are real and they're really interesting for us to experiment with more. So that's cool. And I thank you all for today. And Benjamin, you're free to come as often as you like, but if you don't feel obligated to come every Monday. And additionally, if you come in late or leave early, as you've seen, that's normal. So, depending on your level of interest, it's really good. And if you feel like writing something, if you can get it to me by Friday, I'll try to sneak it into the book.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for the conversations. And I'd be interested in in coming in next week and joining the discussion. I don't want to intrude too much on your book and everything, so I'd rather get further in the community before I make a contribution like that.
That's very
If you
nice.
want any sources too, you can always just ask in the chat if you're in the meeting, because someone like us, not someone in the room, may have what you want.
Okay.
That's true, but also since you are new in the community and new to XR, that means your opinion is especially valued because once you've been in there for a bit, it's very easy to make it, to not remember the early weird stuff. So if you have any early weird stuff, that's absolutely worthwhile too.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Have a good week, everyone. And become jaded indeed, Carl. And on that note, bye.